We are being called to expand our awareness and capabilities, to broaden our definition of science and our perceived limitations of technology. We are being called to again learn to speak the universal language of the heart, to hear the voices of indigenous communities, to connect ancient and modern wisdom. In alchemy, the tetrahedron is associated with fire. As we light the Kundalini fire within us, we connect with the fire of the earth, her energy rising through us as serpents of magma rise from the core, the primordial vibrations that lead us through the darkness. It's through individually reconnecting with her that we can collectively move from the shadow of the masculine back to the womb of the divine feminine. By tuning into this higher vibration through conscious intention, the creation frequency of love, gratitude, and abundance, we connect with her transmission to us, tipping the scales to achieve a more balanced, sustainable relationship with our planet. The earth is alive, and she is speaking to us. She is a giant ball of light, a crystalline entity, sailing through space, sustaining life through her breath of tides of death and rebirth. We have the power and the technology to generate free energy for every soul living on this earth. We have the power and the technology to provide healthy, organic food to everyone. We have the power to heal our waterways and our airways, our ecosystems, and our bodies. We have limitless power, accessible from the center of our hearts, a lotus that contains all the information ever seeded in the universe. We are being called to learn how to truly love ourselves, and then we are being called to see ourselves reflected everywhere. A new golden age is possible only when we align our free will with the highest possible collective good, giving voice again to the earth. We are being called to change our ways, to look at our shadows, our self-defeating patterns, our addictions, and the wounded child inside us. It's time to embrace and integrate the darkness, to consciously transmute fear into love, to heal the divide between masculine and feminine, old and new. It's time for us to truly understand on a cellular level that we are integrated, intertwined, eternal beings of divine energy, boundless and endless.
Ladies and gentlemen, that voice that you just heard right there was Karina Allison. And I bet you wonder why we started off with such a piece, especially with the all-seeing eye overlaid on top of a map. We'll get there. This specific guest and I go quite a far ways back. We'll get into that as well. But I bet you thought, wow, a lot of what I'm hearing could have been pulled straight out of Kymatica. And it's true. A lot of what was being spoken in that may not on the surface of it seem like it would actually come from 20 years of researching and educating about Earth systems as a professional volcanologist. But that is exactly the film, and the piece that you saw was attached to Karina Allison's lifelong venture of researching volcanoes. Through her love of volcanoes, she has found spiritual education and initiation into the mystery schools of both ancient traditions and the earth herself, a path that was accelerated after literally being struck by lightning on the slopes of Kilauea in 2009. We'll get to that as well. Since then, she has been on a journey to heal both ancestral and physical traumas, including complex PTSD, endometriosis, and a broken back. As the founder of UpLight Ventures, she now mentors others to connect with and become empowered by their own inner volcanic landscapes, particularly in the realm of post-trauma thriving. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get Karina in here on the Ben Stewart Podcast. And we're here. Cienega. I've been calling you Cienega for quite some time, and I love that because I remember when that little switch happened. I remember when you introduced that name, and I loved it from the moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you hear me calling our guest Karina Cienega, that's why. Um, but I just want to say hi. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Ben. I am so thrilled to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be a great one. This is a topic that you and I have talked about for some time now. I remember. So here's the way we met. Um, so just a tiny bit of backstory that maybe you and I didn't share back then, but 2012 was a hell of a year for me, and I had just gotten off a 3-month tour speaking throughout Europe, and I get home. This was right after meeting Barbara, my now wife, and it let's just say for various reasons I went on this long fast. I lost a lot of weight. I became emaciated. I never even fully gained back all the weight, but then a friend, Deanna, asked me. I had met her in Australia and then again in London. She was like, you should go down to Chichen Itza on December 21st. And I said, no. And she was like, I'll pay for everything. And I said, no, I'm really just not having it. My world kind of fell apart at this point. And somebody else that I met on that tour, let's just call him Ubiquitous Fire, he connected with me and was like, hey man, I bought you a ticket. I bought everything. You're going down to Chichen Itza on December 21st, 2012 with me. And this was like the second way the universe came at me saying like, okay, the first time I made it sound like it was a question, but it's not. You're going. And so I was like, okay. So I go and we land in, what was it, Cancun, and we take the bus. And on the bus, there you were. And so we had, I don't know, a couple hours to talk, to learn who each other were. And I don't even know if we met up once we got there. I don't even know if we saw each other again once we actually got there. But what I do remember is Cienega was launching into all of this research on volcanoes. And I didn't even have the conversation with her. Ubiquitous Fire did. And he came to me afterwards and he was like, this is blowing my fucking mind. You're going to want to listen to her. And I really trust his opinion. So I did. And here we are so many years later, 10 years. And what I would really like to understand, for the audience to understand also where I'm at, is kind of not just what got you into your love for volcanology and what brought you deep into understanding something deeper than just geology, um, but also how has it changed over the years since you dove in. And I'll let you kind of tell the story, but you dove in doing it academically, but you kind of went off on this other path, and all of a sudden, let's say the PhD group wasn't having it, and then all of a sudden you found yourself in this brand new field where you were able to kind of deviate away from academia, or at least the overly structured, strict environment of academia. So let me simplify that question. How did you get into your love for volcanoes, and how has it evolved since I met you?
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And yeah, I just want to say I remember that moment so well. And I think I even I had all these maps that we're going to look at. I had them at the airport, and I was showing our friend Ubiquitous Fire these maps. I was so fired up about it, and it was the reason I went on that trip. Like, I was so deep in the experience of channeling, honestly, this research, and had such a clear guidance to go into the and the just often. And I guess to back up, where that really started, I have been a geologist, and I've ever since I was a kid in of all places, I, for whatever reason, just absolutely fascinated by volcanoes. I remember seeing
a documentary on Pompeii when I was young, and it just like sparked something for me. And so it was always this curiosity that I had. And then I specialized in it. So I did my undergrad in geology, and then I did a master's program in physical technology, and fit that in 2007. And some things happened. I got married at that time, and between 2007 and 2009, I moved in the corporate world, quickly realized that was my path. My marriage fell apart, and in 2009, I was 29, so Saturn returns. I found myself living out of my car, having walked away from a job, having a marriage, and just broken and clear that really the only place that I felt like I could go at that point in time to the Big Island, because I felt like, who am I to call myself volcanologist? Just graduated with this degree. I don't feel like I own it until I've gone and met Pele. And what's interesting is that almost every volcanologist I know, they speak about Pele with friends. It's like thought, but she has there's an element of mystery, very, very much so in volcanology. It's a science that connects us to the mystery. And it was in it that I know that's, gone deep into it. Just recognize, it's like the more that we learn about it, the less that we really know, so it's like, we really don't know a lot about the nature of this earth. And we do know a lot, but really when it comes to the essence, so much that's still, questions. And so then so that landed me on the Big Island, and I proceeded to have this really magical, synchronistic journey. Up actually being struck by lightning. I lived in the jungles at the base of Kilauea there. Excuse me. I had just gone out, I would go out to the lava and I'd pray for guidance to show me, what is my path? Like the realities of careers and volcanology, I realized were like, I could be a consultant, I could go into extractive industries, which my heart was not into at all. I just felt really, really lost. And, so anyway, long story short, that's what happened. And I was struck by lightning. And it was very this dramatic thing. And also very lucky. And I don't want to go too much into that story because there's so much to talk about. But I'll say it has had lasting effects. I didn't have a physical effect like on the surface of my body, but I could feel the electricity moving through me. The first thing that I thought was that I had been given a gift, and I just didn't know what that was. But shortly thereafter, it was like the consciousness of the earth was speaking to me directly. It was like I had been initiated into the nerve system of the earth. And it was like, oh, you want to understand volcanoes, like more volcanoes than you've studied in your books. And it, wow. That's so that's this project we're talking about really was born. And I just started listening, actually it was hard to listen because this consciousness of the earth, what I would call it, it's like, you had a woman on recently. I was watching some of your old episodes. She's an animal communicator.
Yeah, Dita Young.
Yeah, and it reminded me of this because it's a subtle way of communication with other living beings that don't speak English in the language, as humans, but like biologists will connect with plants, or bullets and hear messages of the plants. We can hear the messages of animals. And so my experience was in the same way, like learning to tune myself to listen to the earth. And she had to say, she has a lot to say. And this project started coming through, and it was really a mix of information that was coming in visions and dreams, channeling and different directions. And my science mind would go in those directions and be like, okay, I want to be objective about this. I want actual data points, So it was this merging of these two worlds and really intentionally working with a foot in each of these worlds. And like this inspiration that got seeded, like I received this gift of inspiration to go down this path. And I gathered this video that we just saw that it was in 2013. I finished that, and then I put a website together and I put it out on the website, and I had one talk that I did in Malibu, California. And at that point, I was like, all of this is still new for me. I was still integrating this experience of the lightning and these channels that had opened in me. And I, even when I met you in Chichen Itza, it was like, I have this thing, but I don't really know what it is. And I had doubt of myself, and like, is this something, or am I just making this up? That's the so long story short, I don't need to go into what happened. There was a series of events that happened after I went public with it that made me realize it was very sobering, and it was very much like, I actually am on something, and this doesn't actually feel like the right time to be putting it out there, and there's more work that I need to do. And then I took everything offline. This is the first time I'm coming back publicly with this, so it's 9 years, and that's like a full gestation cycle in a sense, which is really cool. And we're coming in on just on the tail end of the Scorpio eclipse, so it's like the earthing of, like, really inner earth, unearthing these aspects of in this project in my life, and this information that I feel like now we are ready, like the world is ready for the other pieces that come in that time. Like you mentioned,
I think I sense volcanic eruptions socially. I sense them nationally. I sense them economically. I sense symbolically volcanic eruptions all throughout the world now, whereas when you were releasing it before, let's say just in the economic world, we just had a huge financial upset, but we did some magic and some voodoo on it and pretend like it wasn't going to affect anything. And here we are later experiencing the ramifications of it. I too feel like that was a very vibrant time. Even when I put out my films before, it was like a glorious time where a lot of people wanted to look beneath the veil. But it didn't even seem as polarized back then as it does now. And it feels like the volcanic eruptions are happening now. I think this is really powerful because while most people are looking at politics, while most people are looking at specifics, like looking at the veneer of what's happening, especially through the lens of social media, and saying, oh, I have a grasp on why people are so upset. And I don't think people know why people are upset right now. I think a lot of the times we are reacting to things underneath the surface, and we put language around it that just makes sense, context that everybody else can understand. Oftentimes in a relationship, you can say, what's wrong, honey? And it's like, oh, it's just this guy in traffic and blah, 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 when none of that's actually what's upsetting the person. So without launching deeply into that, I also think that now is really the time. And also just for the audience and Gordo, let me know if you heard the same thing. It was the audio was chopping up just a bit. I could still catch everything that was being said, but Gordon, was that happening on your end too?
Yeah, it's just a little bit of, I think, just latency.
Okay,
but
because I was still able to catch everything that was there.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure for the audience's sake. I'm sure this is all divinely orchestrated anyway. And what's going to transmit is going to transmit. So I wanted to double click on something super quick. Really love the fact that you said you had to actually literally embody the nervous system of Gaia, the nervous system of the earth, and that intelligence. There's what is the movie Dogma, Jay and Silent Bob, where the whole thing about you can't hear directly from God, you have to hear from an angel. If you were to hear God's voice, your head would explode. For some reason, I kind of feel that happened with you. It's just like, you want to download? Well, you're not just going to get this little ding, you've got mail. It's going to be like a lightning bolt on a volcano. And so I would love to just really quick, if you can put words to it before we start hopping into the science and start hopping into the things that I would really love to touch a lot of what you did discover, the maps, the grids. We're going to show the audience a lot of cool stuff. But real quick, in that moment, what do you think the deepest, most profound lesson that you could put into words came from that download?
We are electromagnetic creatures, and the earth is an electromagnetic creature, and we are part of this system. We are not separate from it. And the source of all of our trauma is that we think that we are. And we have created a society where we have put value on the different ways that we actually do disconnect.
Yeah.
The simple act of putting bare feet on the earth, like laying on the earth, does more for us than we have any idea. We can't be separate from it. We are part of it, and it is intelligent, it's alive, it's conscious.
Yeah. And we call people who put their bare feet on the ground hippies and vagabonds. And we have all these social classifications for the behavior that looks so woo-woo, so disconnected from science and reality and linear thinking, that to simply step on the ground, feel the breeze as if it's actually whispering something to you. The indigenous did it. All of our ancestors did. And now it's just silly superstition all of a sudden. So I really appreciate you mentioning that there is no disconnecting ourselves from nature other than the ways we already have, which is in mind, assuming that we are not. And that is the only way in which we are disconnected. And unfortunately, we're seeing that has a huge cost to it. With that being said, thank you so much. I really love that answer. And I guess to kind of launch into the meat and potatoes of it, you told us about Pele. You told us that was where it started for you. But where did it start on the map? I want to give the audience something visual. Like, where did the first either aha moment or first volcano or first time that you were like, wait a minute, if I put this geometric pattern on this map, that actually connects between, so where did it start with you?
Cool. There's a clip that can show the audience as well. It's the clip number 1. That's the overview of these maps. And to lead into that, so basically we're like the seed inspiration, nothing to do with geometry and all of that stuff that emerged from it. The seed of inspiration was that I got so curious about the different volcano mythologies. And I know that was really fast what just seen. Basically, this is a copy of the dynamic planet map from Smithsonian, and it has every single volcano mapped on it. And so maybe we could go back to the very start of that and pause there.
Okay, yeah, pause it right there.
With
right
all
here.
of those labels.
With all
So
the names.
these are, I actually created, this is an Illustrator, and I created different layers for every single volcano that I find a mythology about. And my criteria that I was looking at was that the mythology has has been around for a long time, and it's still currently alive in those cultures. So there's still a spiritual connection to a mythology in each of those little dots that you see. And I put them into layers by their archetype. So in other words, like you'll notice all around the map, there are different stories that are the same. So for instance, like some are the birthplace of a culture. Like this is the volcano where we actually emerged out of, or some just an entity or a being that they bring offerings to. Some are like a father figure or a mother figure. World tree, some world, and so I turn putting them in different layers. I could turn off and on each of those layers by their archetype, so I could see the geographical distribution of every mythology. And yeah, you see that's what each of those individual images are. So where this pattern from is when I turned on all of the layers that had to do with our connection to other dimensions. So they're in the Pacific Ocean. These are like the navel of the world, like the creation stories.
Creation stories, as in we emerged from the volcano, something akin to that?
Literally, like we have an umbilical cord to that volcano.
Wow.
Or that's like an umbilical cord to the consciousness of Gaia.
The womb, almost. She's like the birthing canal.
And so that's one of the archetypes. Did you discover these archetypes?
So these are documented. Like if you go to these volcanoes and talk to people, you will hear these stories.
Right, understood. I mean, I noticed in your work there's 3 archetypes.
Right.
So there's the gates of hell archetype there, and the other 2. One of them was the origin story one, or
right. So the Pacific Ocean, it's the creation, or like I would call the umbilical cord to Gaia.
the umbilical cord of Gaia. Yeah.
Call it creation. Like I call it them each tetrahedrons because they have this element of being somewhat 3-dimensional. There's the creation tetrahedron and the Pacific Ocean. And then in Asia, those volcanoes that created that shape are the active world tree.
World tree, okay.
And so that creation tetrahedron is actually a perfect it's a perfect equilateral triangle. And then in the Atlantic Ocean, there's the gates of hell. And so there are other volcanoes that carry these archetypes, but this pattern is what came through of the one in Asia, the world tree, and the one in the Atlantic Ocean are parallel to the equator. And that they're also both, that's an isosceles triangle. The one in Asia is also an equilateral triangle. And they have this component of being the symbolism of that archetype. In the symbolism of the archetype of the world tree can be found in different traditions as this star tetrahedron, and it's the union of masculine and feminine. It's like the spine, this axis that allows all different dimensions, all different frequencies to become part of the experience. The tetrahedron of creation, it actually looks like this belly, like an umbilical cord. And the Atlantic Ocean, the gates of hell, the symbol that came through. I want to be careful how I say this. The symbol, it's the symbol of the eye triangle, which has been, which has come to sort of represent an aspect of what I would call the distorted masculine. Right. So I put that symbol in that was like a piece of child of this eye, and I put it as it's a phi ratio, and then I saw all of these very symmetrical connections that all of these different geometries have to each other, and so felt. And then there's this eye. You'll see it in just a second. It's the Eye of Mauritania, which is a very unique geologic structure in Africa, and it's the only one like it in the world. And it's kind of a it is so volcanic, and it exists right there in that little crook of the eye, right there. So I started finding all of these synchronicities and all of these overlaps and all of the ways these geometries seem to be connected to each other. And then I started looking at, well, what is this, and what I'd like to give the caveat to listeners is that it isn't really about the lines on the map. It's so many aspects of this project that, and it's one of the reasons I haven't been public about it, because I feel like in order to actually have this be a scientifically accepted, so there's a lot more that need to be done, and one of them is map projection. This is a flat map of the earth, and we have these geometry. What is that actually? How does that translate? And so I don't focus too much on the actual lines of the map, although I do define these very sacred geometries that correspond with that mythologic archetype. And what else is interesting is that in the Atlantic Ocean, it overlays this mythologist.
Yeah.
In the Pacific Ocean, it overlays with Lemuria. And then in Asia, it overlays with the mythology of Meru, which is another so-called ancient civilization of
Meru.
gods, Mount Meru.
Yeah, so because you chopped up just a little there, but the one in Asia is Meru.
Mount Meru.
Mount Meru.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I was asking a little earlier was because I find this super fascinating. I love that you went in. So there's people who just read a lot of mythology, and what they end up reading a lot is Greek mythology, and then maybe Roman, maybe some Indian, maybe some Norse. But it seems like when you went into volcano mythology, that you ended up seeing a deeper side of mythology than most other people get into. And what I love about this is mythology. We're at a point now where, we have this idea that myth is just legend and lore and story. And it's when we were primitive and we didn't know any better, and kids were asking why too much, so we need to come up with a story. And we just ended up telling these stories, generation after generation after generation. And even if it were to have happened just like that, it's interesting that we think it would hold no wisdom. It would hold nothing for us, these stories being passed down over time. But that you looked into it and you were able to see there are all these stories, but it seems like there are these major categories: the world tree, the gates of hell, and the creation myth. I think that's something that I just want to hover over just for a second, because I love that what you did there was you distilled these formations, or what would you call them? I want to say Earth extravaganza points. But there's something about these spots that you found because of the stories and the narrative nature surrounding them. You found some archetypes that allowed you to lay over some geometries, and it just worked. So that, to me, I love, because it sounds like you followed a path of synchronicities that was a part of your own self-discovery, but it also perfectly fit with the external world thing that you were working on, and it has some overlap. It has some overlay there. What I would love to do is take a look at some of your favorite myths in connections, or maybe points that you noticed there was a connection that you weren't even looking for, something that kind of just like grabbed you in your research to where you were like, you noticed something that light bulb clicked on and you're like, wow, I wasn't even searching for that, but now I see this connection and I can't unsee it. Was there a moment like that in your research?
Oh, so many moments like that. Just want to something that you just said, though, because thank you for that reflection. And, I'd like to just suggest this is a criteria that I had. These are places where this mythology is still alive. And it's alive because people still are having mystical experiences in this place. Going to the big, in my own personal experience, meeting Pele and being so humbled by something I can't possibly explain, that's so much bigger than me, that affirmed all of the stories I had heard, and hearing other people, almost everybody that I met, having a story either of their own or of somebody they know, of experiencing this archetypal energy as a very real interaction, that there was something about power of that place. There was some kind of energy palpable on the Big Island that was living through, that was allowing this myth to continue, right? So where I kind of landed with that is this idea of that maybe the mythology is coming from the land, the power and the energy of the land actually speaking to some aspect of our subconsciousness, that there is a dialogue happening between the subconscious and earth. So these mythologies were actually seeded by the energy of the land itself.
Wow.
And that has lived on. And it's like if you go into a room where people have been arguing or there's been a big fight and you walk into that space, even if you have no idea what just happened, you can feel that energy. And compare that to if you walk into a space where a beautiful ceremony was just held. You feel a completely different vibration and energy, and your subconscious mind automatically wants to make a story about what you're feeling.
That's so true. That's so true. And the fact that the subconscious mind wants to make that story from something that we're feeling, and that entire cultures would feel the resonant truth of these myths and that it's still alive. It's something that really harkens back to the original thing that in that video that we saw at the beginning. It really the way that you were speaking about our connection with nature and how it can be reactivated, I feel like the answers are so alive. They're so right next to us, within us. They're beneath us and above us. And so, yeah, I mean, the question that I had, I'm still curious about it, but I guess there's something deep that I liked about the longer video, which was what, 3 hours? Wasn't there like a 2 or 3 hour video?
It was close to 2 hours.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I remember seeing in that one, and also in the shorter clip that you sent us, is you were mentioning the Schumann resonance, and you were mentioning like these frequencies, and you were even talking about some technologies that have the capacity in their use, especially at scale, of creating earthquakes, changing weather, everything down to behavior of like migration within animals and just general behavior. How does that tie into volcanoes?
Well, okay. I feel like where all of this research took me is to electromagnetism, and that was really the key for me to make sense of what was coming forth. And that even led me to this PhD program to study volcanogeophysics and learn about the electromagnetic landscape of the Earth. And well, I would say a lot of my hypotheses about all of this are certainly not accepted in mainstream science. And it's one of
Don't worry, not
the
everything on this show goes by the way of mainstream science. So we love
We want your
Snopes.
approval, mainstream science.
Yeah, we're gonna Snopes everything you say from here on out. So.
PolitiFact.
So mainstream science, you know, the Schumann resonance, and to describe the Schumann resonance is the resonance between the Earth surface where we are right now. It's like we're in this envelope between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, and it's 0.8 hertz, around 8 hertz, and it's a constant frequency, like it's a heartbeat of the Earth. And mainstream science would say it's produced by lightning within that envelope, and it's completely disconnected from any mantle processes or core processes. What's interesting is that we actually require that frequency to function. Like, and they learned that putting astronaut, and they were going a bit crazy.
Yeah.
And they had to reproduce this resonance in order for them to function. And then Tesla discovered if he tapped into that frequency, that's how he generated free energy, resonance. So my feeling is that none of Earth's systems are isolated. And it's like she's a macrocosm of our microcosm. Like if you're a doctor and you die a place on the wrist, you know, and you can get in there and say, this is exactly what the bones are doing. This is what the muscles and tissues are doing right here, you know. Yeah. Energy bodies, that it's not that simple. Like if something's wrong with your wrist, it might be that something is happening, you know, in your knee, or like, you know, there's bigger system that's all interconnected, and it's all self-organizing and working in harmony to achieve this state of health. And so I say that Earth Schumann resonance just exists as this isolated frequency, you know, doesn't make sense to me. I feel like it must be connected. Everything in the Earth systems are connected. That this is also kind of a fast, you know, way up there in the atmosphere. They are finding that there's electromagnetic anomalies before an earthquake happens, like way deep down in the lithosphere.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. So it's
a precursor.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing I'm feeling is like, you know, we scratch our heads when animals respond to an earthquake or a tsunami days before, right? And we're scratching our heads, and they're just connected. They're outside, constantly in the sun, constantly touching the earth, not, you know, layering a layer of rubber between their feet and the earth, not staring at screens or pondering, you know, what somebody else might be thinking of them. They're very much so listening, in a listening state at all times. And so it is, that's kind of fascinating that you would mention that, but there's something about it that doesn't surprise me at all. I was just listening to this Alan Watts thing that was like, we have this idea of looking at an organism and the environment as if they're two different things. One's the puppet of the other, whichever way you think. And he said that, like, it's only by our ability to break like something that is one phenomena down into multiple, that we're able to see something like, well, that's so interesting that this thing up in the ionosphere would happen and then an earthquake. Like, how does it know? Like, well, you're talking about one thing. And when you were mentioning diving into your wrist or something like that, imagine like, sticking a syringe in there and squirting something in there and believing that it's just going to stay right there, or sampling a part of the river because you want to know what the river is like right there, right? It's silly because the river in one more second is not going to be just like that. It's this interconnected system. So
It's
that makes all the
reductionism.
sense in the world. I would love to hear a little bit of, if there's something that you have that you think is worthy of sharing about the electromagnetics of volcanoes. Is there something interesting there that you studied or that you found out about? Does magma channels, or let's say, I've heard of inerton fields around like ancient, even dead volcanoes, but I'm curious, what kind of research have you gotten into to show how volcanoes and magma channels may either produce or be part of the system of the electromagnetics of the Earth?
That's a great question. Thank you. And I would love to do that research. It's been an objective of mine for the last 10 years. And I hoped I had been able to do that in the PhD program I was in, but that didn't happen, unfortunately. But my sense, like what has come through for me in this project, is that all communication is electromagnetic, right? Our thoughts are electromagnetic. When we speak words, there's electromagnetic impulses that move from the neurons in our brain to translate into speech. And magma channels, by their nature, are electromagnetic. They're moving us frequently. They're translating an electromagnetic current coming from the deep inner earth up to the surface. And even if you take an even broader perspective, the magma moving inside of the earth, like in the outer core, is what is thought to produce the magnetic field, which is all the way at the farthest reaches, right? So there's like a communication that's being generated by magma moving, that is both connecting the core to the surface to the farthest reaches of the solar system, where there's communication in the form of electromagnetism that comes in from the sun, from whatever else we're encountering as we hurtle through space. And the magnetic field is like our protective bubble, like the edge of our aura. So there's this element of volcanoes of volcanic.
Wow. That's super cool. What is it? The body, or not the body electric, the electric universe that speaks about these, see if I can remember the name, because you notice redshift around some of these channels as well. But they're plasma channels or ion channels between large galactic bodies or galaxies in general, and different solar systems. But these plasma channels or ion plasma channels, with technology that converts these channels into something that you can actually see, because looking up into the night sky you can't. It actually looks like neurology. It almost looks like, on an invisible scale, the entire universe would look and behave quite like neurology would. There are also some interesting correlates between the amount of neurons and synapses in our brain and cosmic phenomena as well, cosmic bodies, I should say. So that's super fascinating right there, and the fact that everything is electromagnetic in the way that we communicate. It's also very interesting when you get into causation versus correlation. That's why when you said this thing happening up in the upper ionosphere, and just almost a few seconds later or however long later, an earthquake or that kind of seismic activity could happen. is one causing the other? We get into this very, very linear way of thinking rather than seeing it as a system where it's like maybe one is not causing the other, but you're seeing a correlation of one another. And I think this is why our ancestors in the indigenous, they did a lot of listening, rather than having to wrap words around it and turn everything into, oh, I just had an insight and I'm going to say it first. That way, if anyone remembers, and this turns into science, I said it first. There was a lot of listening going on. There's something I want to hop into in your work specifically, and the way that I wrote it down in my notes here was, so CERN. It's you mentioned CERN lies on the gates of hell tetrahedron, and I know that you said this is still something that you're putting a lot of work into, but I found personal significance to a lot of in your longer form video. You found certain spots that I don't know I've seen anybody else find, because you kind of put this geometry, and you notice that on these lines, places like CERN would line up. So I'd love for you to start there, like your interest in why you included CERN as being a part of it. What did that mean to you? And were there any other anomalies like that you noticed, that there were man-made structures that kind of aligned with these seeming to be more like Mother Nature grid patterns?
Yeah, there were a lot like that. Well, I won't say a lot. There, especially along that particular line, there's major cities. There's Rome, there's London, there's Paris, there's CERN. I found that really interesting that they more or less, within error, kind of lined up on that, what I call that gates of hell tetrahedron. Another place that's really interesting on that gates of hell tetrahedron is the Bermuda Triangle, which lines up perfectly along the axis between Messiah and Iceland, Hekla and Messiah, and Guatemala and Iceland. And the base of that triangle, or tetrahedron, whatever you want to call it, goes right across the very bottom boundary of the Sahara Desert. So it was a lot of it was like geologic places, powerful cities, ancient sites. And of course, not all of them, but I have found connections with most of the major ones. And some, so there you can see the Bermuda Triangle right there. And the way that these, line up and connect. But CERN in particular, was of interest to me, because basically what they're doing in their experiments, for those who don't know, it's a 27-kilometer circle that is 100 meters underground, and they're accelerating particles as fast as they possibly can, almost at the speed of light, to collide them. And in doing that, they're creating a charged ring that's strong enough to interact with the Earth's magnetic field. And they actually don't even know what the potential impacts and consequences are. Like, there was a quote that I came across at the director at that time was saying, out of this door it comes something, or we might send something through it.
Yeah. Gordon, go back to the logos for CERN and pick that blue one. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I get it. It's circles and like things that go into circles. I just have to note, because a lot of people that follow me would expect me to point this out, that it looks an awful lot like a bunch of sixes connected together. You could also say it looks like nines that are in there. But I get a lot of people who are looking at the, what is it? The Google logo, the Google Chrome logo, and it looks like the exact same thing, like 3 sixes justified to the circle, connected together. So when you're saying it could, like CERN, I forget his name as well, but I remember hearing him saying, like, we could, something could come through this, or we could send something through it. That was vague enough. Most people thinking like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Why would you even say that?
What exactly do you suggest we could send or could bring into this realm. And I've heard plenty enough of this talk of this could open up a portal. Again, it's just talk. But think of that, 100 meters below ground. That's where this thing is. That last picture gives you a little bit of scope for how deep 100 meters below ground actually is. But it is interesting. And didn't CERN discover something in 2012? Was it the
Higgs boson particle? Sorry,
was that 2012?
Yeah, they called it like the God particle, but basically they're just smashing particles together at the speed of light almost, creating mini Big Bangs, and then taking a look at it and trying to basically put all the puzzle pieces back together and say, okay, the entire world or the universe is made of particles. So this is all just a huge way for them to also to try to justify reductionism or, materialism. But what's unique is if anybody is, and then the fact they have this, Indian mythology in front of it, if anyone does have any sort of other angle to this purely besides physics, these are some interesting data points that Karina's pointing out, where the location, are they trying to harness in some way this energetic grid pattern, these ley lines, and use this cover story of it's purely just CERN and purely smashed together, or it's, both things are occurring. That's usually how it works. There's levels to these things, but it's hard to prove. And a lot of physicists would just say that's crazy talk, but it is intriguing.
Yeah, and a lot of physicists, they're being paid money to not have ideas outside of the convention. So, that's why I love we can have these conversations here and, bring as much of conventional wisdom and science as we can to the table, because we won't poo-poo that the way that these conversations are very much so dismissed in academia and everywhere else as just pure hogwash, like completely unfounded. And it's like, it's not completely unfounded. If you hear some of the things that are taken as a given in science, it would, if the right person broke it down for you, you'd be like, how do we just rest on that assumption as the bedrock, and we're going to make all other assumptions from that reference point? If you dig a little, you realize that conventional wisdom and modern day science is still just on an evolution. I'm not gonna bash it, because I love science. I love how it dives into new questions and new territory. But when it turns into institutions, a lot of the times it's just like, no. There's a story we're going to stick with, and then there's stories that are just absolute conspiracy theory and hogwash. But
that's not science. And that's where, Karina, I give you so much respect. You're being a true scientist. You're staying curious. You're following the data, and you're keeping an open mind. And my grandfather was an infectious disease doctor for a long time, and he always, till this day, tells me that this is truly what science is supposed to be. And that's who we like to talk to, is scientists who are still living that ethos, instead of this bizarre new redefined version of science, which is becoming more like a dogmatic ideology and more cult-like than what it should be, this constant testing and trialing and error, and there's never any fixed thing. It's just until disproven.
Yeah. Scientism has become, it's just science sanctioned by specific authority, just in the same way that religion is magic sanctioned by specific authority. So I think we beat that horse to death. I would love to move on. Like, out of the clips that you sent us, what would you like to move on to from the specific diagrams and things that we can show the audience? Because you've just put in so much work that I want to make sure that we land on all these points.
Oh, thank you. I don't know that we'll have time to land on all the points, but I do want to.
No, you're staying here for 3 hours until we get through this.
I'm
or
biased.
We'll have you back on later. Either way.
There was a couple places that were just so fascinating. The one is the crop circle connection.
Yes.
I would love to show that and just talk about that, because this also actually came through a friend of mine who's a channel, and she was like, there's a crop circle. She's like, you're onto something, and there's a crop circle. And I was like, there's a crop circle. Oh my gosh. Okay. And then I had a dream of this particular crop circle. And this was from Barbary Castle in 1991. And it was one of the original earliest crop circles. And they call it the mother of all crop circles. And it's been very studiously broken down, and all the angles measured, and you can really find a lot of information about this crop circle. And so I overlaid it here on this is on this creation tetrahedron in the Pacific Ocean. And at first I was like, well, it doesn't fit. It's not the same dimensions, and then I shrunk it down to where you see it there. And then I discovered these synchronicities, right? So one being that particular crop circle, I think it's the next image, if you can just pause it there for a second, where their C is, that red C, there's actually a notch, like a very distinct notch in the crop circle itself at that place C. And then if you keep playing, then I circle it with red. So just, yeah, right there. So there's this, everywhere else, the lines are perfectly straight. And then right there at that C, there's this notch. And so then if you move forward keep playing it forward, and then we'll see where it overlays. And so then if you can just keep playing it forward right there. So pause. So that line that goes from the center of that creation tetrahedron, and that
Sri
center
Lanka.
is the island of Moorea. Is right in the center of that tetrahedron is Moorea.
Easter Island.
Like Drunvalo Melchizedek talks about Moorea as well as this really important point. And that there's a line that goes from Moorea to Sri Lanka, which is this other anchor point of that world tree. And it passes exactly through that notch. So I was like, wow, that's so interesting. And then I started looking at the symbolism of these three symbols on the corners. So the one at the top anchors on Big Island on Lake Mauna Kea, which is this mythology of being the umbilical cord. And it's the flower of life, so it's this wheel of life. And that hotspot on the Big Island is one of the oldest hotspots. Magma has been moving continuously from basically the core mantle boundary to that place in the Pacific Ocean for as long as we have record of.
Wow.
It's the oldest, it's the most active. Like it makes sense.
It's also the tallest.
It is, yeah, right, totally. So it made sense to me that would be the flower of life. Like that's the place of creation. And then on the far corner on the right there, that's anchors onto Easter Island.
Yeah.
And that's like the Fibonacci sequence, the way that it's like, the golden mean spiral, but broken into how we, right.
Yeah.
And it also mimics that plate boundary right there, sort of that choppiness of the plate boundary. And then the one on the far bottom left is just a circle, and it has a line. But what was so interesting about that line is it's not exactly half of the circle. It's a little bit longer than half.
It's Pac-Man.
And like in what I read, it was like the interpretation of like the seed of life, and it represents the beginning of life and, something emerging out of that line. Well, if you take that line and you transcribe it to New Zealand, which is where that bottom anchor point was, right there. So that line is exactly the length of New Zealand. If you anchor it there at Tongariro, which is that anchor point, it is exactly the length of New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
So each one of those three symbolisms really fit with the anchor points of this tetrahedron, and having that notch right there, it was too many things lining up. That really blew my mind to find that.
It is interesting how it connects with the world tree there as well. That one anchor point on the world tree.
Now, Karina, do you find this as also being one of the first major crop circles? What is kind of the correlation you're drawing from this? Do you think this was kind of a major sort of beginning crop circle to help us understand the planet better?
Yeah, I do. So what I see in this crop circle is like an antenna. So they have these in the very center there, you have these concentric circles.
Yeah, it looks like an antenna, or it looks like a dish, you'd see for a satellite or something. Yeah.
Like, it's like for me, it confirmed this sense of these places being like geographical antenna of different resonant frequencies, and that these frequencies are anchored in the mythologies themselves that are born from those places. That it's a communication system. It's a communication system. And there were all kinds of other things that came through with that crop circle that people have written about extensively. And one of them was the day that it came through. And there was some passages in the Bible about the Ark of the Covenant being revealed on that particular day. And it was like the divine feminine, you know, of course, the Ark of the Covenant is connected to the divine feminine. And that creation, what I would call the creation tetrahedron, is the anchor point of the earth's divine feminine. That's our umbilical cord to the earth. That's the oldest living hotspot. That's, you know, there is something so powerful about the energies of anyone who's ever spent time on any of these islands in the Pacific. Like knows there is something really mystical and magical and profound and powerful. Like when I landed on the Big Island, I was just like Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. like this is some other place, you know, and it feels like the veil is really thin. And so to me, it just feels like a message about that this is where the earth's feminine is anchored. And then we have the earth's masculine, which is anchored in the Atlantic Ocean. And then we have the world tree, which is both, and that's anchored in Asia. Like what's so interesting is how the cultures of each of these places have evolved. And then we also see these overlaps with the magnetic field, you know. So there's another map, I think it's clip 3 with the that shows magnetic field. It's actually the changes in magnetic declination, and the changes in magnetic declination from 1600 to I believe 1990. Yeah, if you keep playing from there, I think it's
this one.
Yeah,
here.
this one.
Okay. Here, let me.
And so basically what we're looking at here, where those zero lines are, is these are places where where the magnet on the compass matches up with magnetic north of the planet.
So what does declination mean?
Declining.
It's like, okay. Like the difference, like we're looking at what is the difference between what does the compass say and where is magnetic north. And it's actually always changing, because magnetic, like they're circling, or like polar north is not the same as magnetic north.
Right. That's what I've heard, this whole shift of the Schumann, and like it's always constantly changing. So they're okay.
So I guess I'm maybe saying that confusingly. So like what that declination is looking at, the difference between magnetic north and polar north.
Wow. So then explain again, like, what do you make of this? Like, what was the timeline here that we're looking at again?
Okay, so this starts in 1600s, and now we're looking at it go all the way to 1990. And I was looking at those zero lines and just noticing, it's interesting that the zero lines always stay anchored on that axis mundi, like the world tree. They always stay anchored there somewhere. That's it just seems like a stabilizing force, right? And then through time, so beginning in 1600, you can see the zero lines. Now, what's overlaying here they're called LLSVPs, and these are structures in the deep, they're like on the surface of the outer core, and they affect magnetism, of course. And I also feel there's a connection with these geographical locations. But what I want to point out is that as that played itself out, it was like, if you could go back to that, so if you look at this in the Pacific Ocean, this creation tetrahedron in 1600, we'll see it in a second. But just notice how that it seems to just disappear. It's like there's a big, if you look at the 0 line and the 10 line, like they seem to be going around that creation tetrahedron, and then it kind of disappears. as we get into like the 1800s, 1900s. So you can just keep playing it. Yeah. And that correlated with, the conquistadors and the rise of the Catholic Church, and very much the suppression of the feminine and the feminine voice. So it was almost like the Earth's feminine voice was mirroring what was happening in the culture.
Right.
That's what
Yeah.
I see in this.
I see what you're saying. And how these different cultures reflect the energetic sort of concentration or frequency at that moment, because it's constantly shifting, right? This is a constant shift across the earth based on the magnetic, these are the magma patterns you're tracking here, or
No,
just the
these are
magnetic?
just
These are just
magnetic, but they're connected.
Right.
They're deeply connected, I would argue.
And so how do they actually track these magnetic patterns?
So these are measuring just magnetic, like you can reconstruct this by looking at, say, actually volcanoes, where basalt has erupted. You can see what the magnetic field looks like at that point in time.
Interesting. Wow. Almost like trees or tree rings or something.
Right, totally.
That's cool to have such a visual as well. It really paints an interesting picture. And then those blue lines and those blue formations on towards the end of that map. Explain what that was one more time.
Okay, so those are called LLSVPs.
LLSVPs.
Yeah, and that stands for large low shear velocity province. And there's actually earlier in this clip, there's a cross section that goes through Earth. And we can see them. They were only discovered maybe 15 years ago. And a lot still really honestly isn't known about them. They're still trying to map them. Yeah, that one right there. So these where it's orange and yellow, where it's like standing off from the core right there.
Right.
So it's like these kind of almost like plates that seem to be anchored onto the outer core. And especially in the Pacific Ocean, they're feeding a lot of the hot spots that we see, a lot of the volcanoes, and in the Atlantic too. But specifically in the Pacific Ocean, they've been able to do geochemical analyses that show those volcanoes are erupting magma that they call primordial magma, which in other words, it hasn't evolved through time. So it's like those LLSVPs are like remnants of early Earth in a sense. And it brings into question all kinds of things, like even plate tectonics. Is our understanding of plate tectonics actually accurate? Or is
right, because that would change over time then.
You would think.
Right? Yeah, you would think.
It's not actually showing up in the data.
Blasphemy. Like Egyptology. Nah, we don't want to include it. It doesn't go along with what we want.
Right. Yeah, what I love about this though is it really does call, not everything, but it calls quite a few things into question. Whereas like plate tectonics, maybe even elements of what we know about it are true, but maybe we over assumed what it means. Like something else underneath it may be like it doesn't evolve over time, or maybe not even nearly as quickly, or it just brings all these questions to light that, like, we feel and we sense, and we look back into ancient wisdom, and it says all things change over time. And here's this thing that, is at least on a different time scale. I find that really interesting that came up in your work as well.
And I know you sent this too.
Why'd you bring this up?
Karina sent this to me as well, and I think this is kind of a good moment to kind of touch on this. Do you feel like cymatics is correlated to this as well?
I do.
Because look at how those boundaries are changing over time.
It's like cellular reproduction to me.
And it also seems like there are global planetary resonance patterns that I would argue are anchored in these particular volcanoes.
Right.
And
Okay.
these would be measurable. And this is the research I would love to do someday, is actually measure what are the resonant frequencies. It's like we can do this in biology. They already have done this. Different biological processes have a different frequency signature.
Right. Right.
And
And
when you say frequency signature, you're probably talking about most things come in symphonies rather than just a single frequency. And that's what you're kind of talking about, right? Is like a fingerprint, a unique harmony,
yeah,
almost like a symphony at these spots. I would love for that research. Let me ask you the question: what would it take to get that research done? In our economy today, and a good
oh my
can't.
gosh. Well, it's obviously not going to get done in academia for me right now. So I've pretty much put the nail in that coffin.
Private funders, like
Yeah,
what?
private sector.
Let's say somebody was listening right now and they were like, "This is so fucking fascinating," and I when I sneeze, $1 million comes out. Like what would something like this be? And just fantasize about it, because like, where would you want to go if you had the funding and you could research this and you knew what technology you had to bring along? What would that look like?
Well, it would look like going to these different, I would call them nodal points. And that's why I love why I wanted to show that with the sound and the sand, because that's where it's not lines on a map. They are nodal points, and there's a planetary pattern.
Yeah.
And maybe there's multiples. And I would say I would argue that there's probably like 3 at least, but 3, 1 for each of these geometries that are creating different grids.
Right.
And I would argue those are connected to our consciousness. How could it not be? We're impacted by electromagnetic fields. And so what are the signatures of each of those grids? What do those measurements look like? I would suggest we would see them in infrasound, and these are also really new emerging niches, geophysics within the last 5 to 10 years, is infrasound, and that's what I went into this PhD program to study. And that's sound that's below the level of human hearing, but it travels really far distances. And that is actually 8 hertz is an infrasound signal. And these volcanoes are showing infrasound signatures at that level. So can we map that globally? What does that look like? And then the other place is RF frequencies. And they're just getting into studying the different radio frequencies of erupting volcanoes. And they're finding that there's a background radio frequency signature that can't be explained. And so I would suggest that is probably a measurable thing at these places that can also be correlated and could give a lot more information about these different grids and the nodal points of those grids. And it's the same thing. If you have 3 things that resonate at the same frequency, is how they can break glass using their voice in opera. You create that level of frequency, and everything that's resonant with it, everything within that, that has a resonance for that particular frequency, is going to start vibrating and becoming active. So I would even go so far as to say that could be used for prediction, and if one volcano, if you can map the resonances of different volcanoes and sort of what their signature frequencies are, and one is erupting, there's probably a really good chance that everything on that nodal network is going to be impacted by it on some level.
When you look at cymatics and you think of this concept, because I think you're really onto something here, I totally feel something, this idea of these nodal points. So what you're saying, just for clarity, that certain specific spots on Earth are holding one of these. So every one of these specific frequencies creates this pattern, right? So at 144 hertz, you get that pattern. At 380, and it's these specific frequencies, these fixed frequencies, create these patterns. Do you feel there's these physical structures, volcanoes or natural things, that are holding these set frequencies? And then when they erupt, do you think that's it holding the pattern, or maybe it's the in-between occurring and it's shifting your frequency? I'm just curious how you just
It's a
yeah.
great question. It's a question I have.
Right.
I don't know that I don't have an answer to that, but I think it can be measured and studied,
Right.
and there can be conclusions made about that. Whether they're actually fixed or whether it's genuinely a dynamic system. But
Right.
even in our dynamic body systems,
Right.
we have fixed frequencies
Right.
that are
The organs and stuff, right?
generated by certain processes that are
Mm.
operating in a healthy system. And then when they are off that frequency, we can see that it's an unhealthy, there's something unhealthy in that organism. So that's my feeling, is that I feel that they're fixed frequencies, and that by monitoring maybe changes of those frequencies in time also, we could be studying sort of the dynamic evolution of Earth's holistic systems.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So mapping it over time, you'd be able to, I mean, the opportunity arises for you to see this potential evolution in this frequency signature. Curious if you have any thoughts on, in the same way that you, Gordon was asking, how did we map this over time? How do we know those zero lines as they were evolving across the screen? And you mentioned, well, there's things we can study now that still have the signature that tells us what it was like in around that year. Do you think that would be possible for this?
Well, electromagnetism is such a, like, in this level of, if we're looking at sound, or if we're looking at RF, there are moments in time. So I feel like to really start to see that, we would have to just have regular data, moving from time is zero now. I don't know that we could recreate that from the past, if that's what.
Yeah, no, I understand. I was just wondering if there was anything that came up for you in that. So starting now, moving forward, would these be like technologies? Because I'm unaware of the technology, but I'm sure it already exists. What you're talking about, you would, or maybe you would have an engineer tailor fit it to something specific. But these would probably be things that you would, kind of like Dean Radin had these EEGs, these or EGGs, electrogaiagrams instead of electroencephalograms, and he just set them at certain locations, and they were just gathering data from the field in various locations. I would assume this would be what you would do, like go to Mauna Kea on Pele, you put something respectfully there, and also in all these spots, and you just gather data over time, right?
Yeah,
at a central location.
That would be ideal. That would be amazing.
Yeah. So what you would do, because the very first image you showed was all the different volcanoes, which is pretty interesting how they really do hug these very specific lines. It's nice to see them all laid out. But you would focus on probably some main ones from each archetype, correct?
Right.
Yeah. It would be really interesting to know if each archetype had its own signature, what that could also mean. And also if you'd be able to tease some of those signatures out in some way. I mean, like, this may be just reaching too much, but you've heard of people take cricket sounds or frog sounds and slow them down, and it sounds like music.
Right.
There's various other ways of transposing data into music. It would be interesting to find what the signature feels like, if there's a more masculine, or a feminine one, or more, Gates of Hell one. and the Gates of Hell one. So I guess I want to move on to this next question. It's interesting because the Gates of Hell one does sit around Africa and Europe, correct? That's the Gates of Hell one?
Right.
And a lot of this myth, mainly it's just, probably coming up just because my daughter watched this film Percy Jackson, and it's the son of Poseidon, and they basically go through a lot of the myth of Persephone and Hades and the underworld. And so curious, like, if it's the Gates of Hells and they're in that region, a lot of myth comes out of Hades and going into the underworld. I know there must have been similar myths. I believe that I've even read a few from elsewhere where they talk of the underworld, but This really inspires me to want to kind of dive deeper and look into some of the mythologies around these locations and see if, like, oh, gates of hell, and they're talking about Hades, and if it's not Hades, it's by a different name, but it's the same theme. Was there anything like that that you happen to come across
Can you
in
clarify?
some of the other archetypes as well, as like within
Greek?
their myths? They like, let's say the world tree one, where tree is mentioned, or tree of life, or this kind of motif comes up consistently. And then I know that's basically where you got the categories from. But
Right.
was there anything really interesting that you noticed in specific myths that aligned very well? Just something that comes to you?
Well, some of the gates of hell mythologies are not that old, and I actually hesitated to include them at first because, like, the one in Messiah, which is in Nicaragua, it's a lava lake, and it was called the gates of hell by the conquistadors who came there. And because I couldn't find the original mythology underneath that, but that's what lived on into present day. But I imagine that there must have been an older story, from the native people who lived there. But that is the mythology that has lived currently. And so that there were places where I felt like this is interesting. And that's also why I call it the distorted masculine, because I suspect there's a whole set of stories that are like deeper than the gates of hell for these particular places. And that there's something that the Sahara Desert was formed about 5,000 years ago, just kind of overnight geologically. Like, it's kind of a geologic anomaly. Like, it went from being a really lush place, and they even find that like in the Sphinx in Egypt, that there's evidence of a lot of water
Erosion, yeah.
It became a desert, and the fact that the line of that tetrahedron is right along the base of the Sahara Desert. And then those volcanoes themselves are also not actually that old. So I feel like this is speaking to something like a shift that happened in the consciousness fields of the earth. And I have a sense of it being like a control grid, it's a control grid of consciousness anchored somehow in these resonant signature frequencies of these places, and that is being reflected in the mythology.
I'm curious your thoughts on, are you familiar with like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock's work with the Younger Dryas period? What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel that, and I guess kind of in conjunction with that is, how do you feel this maybe lines up or correlates with these cyclical periods of these, massive resets that happen where there might have been advanced civilizations and there's these resets? And do you think this is tied into this cyclical sort of process that's constantly occurring? And also just their work, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with what they're postulating?
I do. I think there's a lot of overlap, and I'm certainly not, an expert in everything that they've done, but I can say I am very intrigued by their work, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And as far as, yes, I do think there are these cyclic, almost fractal time aspects of time. Like there's a video, Gordon, of the grids.
Yeah, I got that one.
And I wanted to overlay these different geometries on the world grid. And the world grid was created based on Platonic solids from the work of Buckminster Fuller, and Becker and Huygens put this together in the 1980s. And it's an icosahedron and a dodecahedron of these Platonic solids that they basically said were a perfect fit to planet Earth. Right? And so this has been around for a while, and there's so many different synchronicities with these grids, like the blue and the white. Like the icosahedron is the color blue, the dodecahedron is the color white.
Of course.
It's water and ether. It's like, this is the alchemical fit for planet Earth. And so I felt like this would be, of course, like a really interesting thing to look at with these geometries. And so then I found, like, actually they fit really well. Like, you have that rotation of the creation tetrahedron. It's a perfect fit to that grid. Mm-hmm. And then if you drop the world tree down, it's also a perfect fit to that grid. But then this gates of hell triangle, it was not a perfect fit.
Right.
And so then I went back and I calculated, because the axis of that gates of hell triangle tetrahedron is the mid-Atlantic ridge. So basically Europe and America are constantly moving farther and farther apart from each other, right? So the two farthest anchor points in Ethiopia and Nicaragua are moving farther and farther apart. So what point in time would that particular shape have fit in that grid?
I see what you're saying.
Right, and it was 26 million years ago.
So do you feel...
What's significant about 26 million years? I know you mentioned this in your video, but for the audience.
So 26 million years ago was the last huge extinction event that we had on Earth. And then if you look back in the geologic record, that's also a cyclic pattern. Mm-hmm. So around every 26 million years, there is an extinction event that happens. Mm-hmm. And then we have these fractals of that time, right? So like the precession of the equinoxes is on a 26,000 year cycle. And then we have the Mayan calendar, which is a 260-day calendar. So yes, I feel like there's definitely much more to this story. And I also feel like you kind of have to step out of time being linear, and even step out of linear thinking to really start letting it land and making the connections between all of these different aspects. And I think there's far more to the story than we know. And a lot of these sites, like I spend a lot of time at Teotihuacan, which are the pyramids outside of Mexico City. Nice. There's so many interesting correlations between those sets of pyramids and the pyramids in Egypt, and there's so much mystery about these places too. And there's all kinds of correlations between these places and these maps, like the pyramids of Egypt. If you draw a line or an axis from the center of if you draw an axis from Morea, the island of Morea, which is the center of the creation tetrahedron. This is from Drumvalo Melchizedek's work. And then it anchors at the Egyptian pyramids. So there's an anchor point there, even though those pyramids aren't on these maps specifically. But then like the Teotihuacan pyramids are at the same latitude as Hawaii, 19.5 degrees. And they are, that 19.5 degrees, if you inscribe a tetrahedron inside of a sphere, that's intersects. So all of these things to me really speak of an energetic crystalline nature of the earth. And then this connection with the volcanoes and the volcanics and the bigger systems of volcanics. And one more thing about the Teotihuacan pyramids, because this is so interesting. They're not oriented to the cardinal directions, which at first I found really strange. But they are, if you look at like a Google Earth image of them, they are oriented to the axes of the volcanic systems across the Trans-Mexican volcano belt. So they're a little bit off center, and you would expect them to be oriented north. I thought that they would be oriented to the cardinal directions, but then you zoom out and their axis is exactly the same. It's parallel to the axis of the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt. And they have the complex of Teotihuacan. At the top of it is a volcano called Cerro Gordo that was erupting, historically. So at the time that this existed, this volcano was erupted. And I think there's something about this merging of fire and water. They were channeling groundwater to move through these underground passages underneath these systems, and the original builders of these places aren't known. Like the Aztecs came and they built on top of it, and
Right.
so we have
Olmecs.
record from that period, but we don't know much about before that.
That's so wild that these, we look at the way that we build architecture today, and you have to question whether it's going to be around in a couple hundred years, and there's so much beautiful, brilliant architecture that has deep significance. Like, there's not a lot of architecture you can look at today. You'd be like, yo, you could look at that piece of architecture right there, and you could discover the mysteries of the universe in it. There's not much that we build today that has that. I won't ever say never, because I haven't seen everything that's out there. I'll probably get schooled by an audience member joyfully. I'd love to be schooled on that. I would love to see that we are really embedding our mythos and embedding our ethos and embedding our cosmology into our architecture. But it really seems like only our economic and balance sheets are factored into it. And if we have the money, then yeah, we can get a little cute and make it kind of a mirrored building that has an interesting shape. But you're right. There's something very interesting about these complexes. Curious if anything came up for you on, because since let's say February with this Russia-Ukraine thing, I started looking deeply into Ukraine and a lot of ancient Ukrainian history. And there are some really beautiful spots of inerton fields of like ancient but dormant volcanoes there. Did anything come up Ukraine for you?
Oh gosh, I haven't looked at it since this started happening there. I remember looking into the Giza Strip area, and there is a lot going on. It's a great question, and it's something I can get back to you on.
Get back to me on that. Yeah, and we'll definitely have you back on. I feel like there's so much more we could touch upon, and like this is one of the most fascinating topics I've gotten into in a long time. I have to say that, because whereas in the world there's a lot of Kanye going on in people's minds, there's a lot of pop culture that's really circulating around, and everyone, it's very easy. It's the lowest hanging fruit to talk about these things. And then we come here today and we're talking about volcanoes, which is something that you think would just be mundane at this point. But really, what you've done is you've offered not even a radically new. I don't feel this is radical. I think it's revolutionary, but it's not radical. It's not way, way, way out there. But what you're looking at is just a slightly different way to perceive that there is deeper meaning and significance behind these structures on Earth, that they potentially don't just have mythology anthropomorphized and plugged into them, but actually they breed mythology. I'm super curious about this, and the cymatics element to it, that these frequencies, they would also feed from a bottom up, like subconscious emerging into the conscious field. They would kind of impregnate us with a mythos that we live by. Yeah. And I just find this super fascinating, and I want to make sure that I don't just ramble. Did we touch upon what you think we could get through today? Because we're definitely having you back.
Thank you so much, Ben. And just thank you for your receiving of this work and your reflections. And I just, like, you have been this constant in my life this past decade, and our paths have weaved these, in these different ways. And just having you believe in this and believe in me has been a real blessing. So I'm just so grateful to be here with you. And I guess my final, point that I'd like to just for the listeners to take home is, like, we've talked about all these things and it's a lot to take in, but I feel like at the end of the day, it's also really simple. And it's this reconnection to the Earth's fields. And that this is in our power, no matter where we live, no matter what is going on in our life. Like, we are being bombarded by external frequencies right now, by EMFs, by Wi-Fi, by Bluetooth, by all kinds of stuff, that are changing sort of the electromagnetic like environment that we live in. And I had some fear around that. And the vision that kept coming through in my meditations is like an eruption coming from the surface of the earth. And it's like she's so powerful. And this simple act of putting bare feet on the earth, I work a lot with obsidian, and that's a whole other thing we could get into, but there's very real medicine and some of these very simple things that we can do, wearing obsidian on your solar plexus, tuning into the 8 hertz, the Schumann resonance. But like that's the resonance of flow state. That's the resonance that healers go into and they're actively healing. This is the earth's, this is where we receive her transmissions. It's like our meditation resonance, meditating with bare feet on the earth, wearing obsidian on your solar plexus is like some of the most powerful things that you can do. And it's so simple. And it actually scientifically is like plugging you in. It's plugging you into the communication network of the earth. It's helping balance your whole field. It heals you. So we have power, even though our external environment is changing. And I don't think it's so much about like saving the earth. It's like learning to calibrate with the earth.
Man, I love that. I love that.
And for the audience, also, Karina has some awesome photographs. I know you've done, and if you're still doing photography work, you've got a great eye. So please check out her fire and water photography. She's got shots from live volcanoes, really cool traveling adventures, it looks like, and some just really cool cinematic ones here with some friends kind of capturing this essence.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely check her out. Check her out on Instagram, as you see right there. Please go to her website, UpLight. Is it just uplight.com?
It's UpLight Your Life.
UpLightYourLife.com. Please check that out. I wanted to show the audience that I'm not huge into collecting crystals. I love crystals, but here is obsidian. And this has been used as scrying, for scrying, which is John Dee apparently got an obsidian ball like this from Montezuma in the Inquisition, and he used it for scrying, which is where you peer into it, you polish it, you look into it, and you meditate upon it, and things will appear in your field of vision. But what I wanted to double click on was, you mentioned the solar plexus, and that is just below the diaphragm, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So what is there something that you have noticed, obsidian right there? And I'll mention why it has significance to me, but is this lava rock, putting it on just below the diaphragm on the solar plexus, is there significance to that spot?
We could have a whole other podcast just on obsidian. I have a lot to say about obsidian, but it's a very protective stone, and it also is very absorbent. So when you wear it at your solar plexus, it's a way to project into your whole field and to, basically keep you protected and keep you in your power, in your center, like keep you anchored in yourself, as it.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. The reason I wanted to mention it is because as I look at the body, I'm very much into movement. I'm very much into understanding all aspects of the human body, but I've gotten really fixated on the myofascial system. And the myofascial system is known by many names, but it's 20% of our body weight. It connects every system within the body. It's a communicative mechanism. It is made of collagen, ground substance, elastin, and water. It moves water due to our movement, and it has been called, which is my favorite, in a liquid crystalline matrix. So as you're mentioning the crystalline structure of the earth, there's the first thing that popped into my mind is that we, through yoga, do mudras by putting our fascia into different orientations, different shapes, if you will. And it allows for the circulation of energy and the communication of light through this fiber optic tissue. Because if you look at it under a microscope, it's fiber optic. The thing about the diaphragm, which is really cool, is when you look at the diaphragm, and Gordon, just go ahead and pull up an image of the diaphragm and the organs that lie above it and the organs that lie below it. You'll see that the organs that, if you look at the diaphragm itself as being the layer of the earth, the crust of the earth, and so the solar plexus sits right below it where all the magma would actually be sitting, this obsidian, before it comes out and then cools. The organs above it are air and fire, like the heart is the sun and the air in the lungs. And then below it is where the other two elements exist. Earth goes into the stomach and water goes down below. And that's below the diaphragm is where you process all of that. And so that's why I was just curious, because if you look at the way the ribs kind of like make the shape up, almost like a volcano, right at the spot where you would put this obsidian. And I don't believe that these things are by mistake. I definitely feel that there's some relation between our body and the earth, hence the communication, hence us being creatures of the earth. So with that being said, I'm done nerding out on these things. I want to say that it has been an absolute pleasure, not just today, but to have known you through this process. I remember it clearly. I remember that bus ride in 2012 going down to Chichen Itza. I'm really glad that we got the opportunity to meet, and I'm just very happy that where my path took me allows for a platform for where your path took you to collide right here and now on this beautiful day. So I want to honor you for sticking with your path. We didn't even get into the PhD. What happened with the PhD program that you were involved in. We'll do that next time. But I want to honor you for sticking to your path, even though academia said bye-bye to you. You didn't say bye-bye to it, and you stayed true to that download that came into you that one day, very painfully, but it stuck with you nonetheless. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for continuing down this path. And I'm looking forward to where this path takes you. And I'm glad that I have a platform to bring a lot of this beauty out to the world.
Thank you so much, Ben, for bringing me on, and just all of your kind words and your support. And I'm glad you have this platform too. Thank you for all of your work in the world. And it's great to weave this moment in time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, wow. What an episode. I bet you weren't expecting something on volcanology today. Unless you looked at who we're going to have on the podcast today, you probably would have expected it would have been something more pop culture, something more current events. But I believe that there's a reason why these timeless things become timely. Why are we talking about volcanoes? I've known about it since, the dawn of my existence, and they've been around since the dawn of our existence. Why would it be important today? Well, when you just slightly shift your perspective, you start to see that these things, they don't go out of hipness. They don't stop becoming relevant. We just move on to different things until these cycles of time thrust them in our face again. And I think that I would be very curious to dive deeper into these topics myself to see how they may even be colliding with a lot of the cycles of time that I've mentioned before in my work. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, Gordon and I try to bring you this kind of quality all the time, something that maybe you didn't expect, but this was mind-blowing to me. I really hope that you found it to be mind-blowing as well. All the contacts and all the links that you will need to dive into this work and also connect with Cienega or Karina yourself, please go into the show notes and dive into all that work. There is so much more than what we covered on this podcast. That's why we're going to have her back. We try and give you this beautiful content every single Thursday, 5 p.m. Eastern. So please keep coming back. Keep following your path the way that you've heard Karina and myself and Gordon. We continue to dive into what we believe is profound and meaningful. I hope you're doing the same at home. And with that, I love you all, and I'll catch you all next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.